The day dawned like any other. The smell of fresh coffee spread through the kitchen as Donna Lucia prepared breakfast. Her movements were gentle, but they carried the weight of the years and the responsibilities she had assumed without hesitation. Her granddaughter, Isabella, only 12 years old, was still sleeping in the next room, clutching her old teddy bear, a gift from her mother before she left. Lucia sighed, tidied the table, and went to the door to get the newspaper. But when she opened the door, she found something that made her heart race: a stamped envelope with formal letters that screamed urgency. With trembling hands, she opened the document and, when she read the first few lines, felt a chill down her spine. Citation for custody hearing of the minor Isabella Martins. Plaintiffs, Eduardo and Patricia Martins, Isabella's aunt and uncle. Lucia felt her legs wobble and had to lean on the door. She knew this day would come, but she never wanted to believe it. Ever since her son and daughter-in-law died in a car accident 6 years ago, she had been the one who raised Isabella with all the love and dedication. They had money, status, and influence, but she had something they never showed: time, patience, and genuine affection. "Grandma." Isabella's voice came from the hallway. The girl was still rubbing her eyes sleepily, her hair a mess. Lucia quickly folded the paper and forced a smile. "Good morning, my flower. Sit down. Coffee is already on the table." But the girl was smart. She looked directly at her grandmother, suspicious. "What happened?" Lucia hesitated for a moment, but knew she couldn't hide it for long. She sat down next to her granddaughter, took her small hands in hers, and took a deep breath. "Your uncle's filed a custody request. We'll have to go to court." Isabella frowned and was silent for a moment. Then she squeezed her grandmother's hands tightly. "But I don't want to go with them. I want to be with you." Lucia felt tears threaten to fall, but she held them tight. She ran her hand through the girl's hair and smiled, even though her heart was tight. "Then we'll fight, my love." While they were drinking coffee, Lucia already knew she needed help. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in a long time. "Dr. Marcello, it's me, Lucia. I need your help." The phone was still glued to Lucia's ear when Marcello's voice sounded on the other end of the line. "Lucia? What happened?" She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "It's about Isabella. Her uncle's filed a custody request. I received the summons earlier today." There was a brief silence, followed by a heavy sigh. "I imagined this could happen one day. But now, after so many years..." "That's right." Lucia looked at her granddaughter, who was finishing her coffee, distracted. "They never cared before. Why now?" Marcello hesitated before answering. "Lucia, you know how these things work. Eduardo and Patricia have always had money and influence. They might be thinking about the family's image. Or maybe they think Isabella is old enough to be molded into their lifestyle." Lucia pressed her lips together, feeling her blood boil. Molded was exactly the word she feared. "Can you help me?" "Of course, Lucia. We'll fight for this. But I need to understand everything. I'll come by later." She hung up and forced herself to take a deep breath. She needed to stay calm for Isabella's sake. But her mind went back in time to when the girl was still a baby. The accident that took her parents was one of the most painful days of her life. Lucia remembers arriving at the hospital with her heart racing, only to hear the worst news of all. Her son and daughter-in-law didn't make it. And in the middle of all the pain, there was a small, innocent baby not understanding what was happening. That day, as she held little Isabella in her arms, Lucia made a decision. She would give everything she had to ensure that her granddaughter grew up surrounded by love and protection. And so was Isabella grew up surrounded by storybooks, the smell of freshly baked cake, and nights of soft music to help her sleep. She grew up hearing stories about her father and mother, how loving and dreamy they were. Lucia did not let their absence be a void, but rather a fond memory. While her aunt and uncle spent years without even visiting her, Lucia was the one who held her hand on her first day of school. She was the one who rushed to the hospital when she had a high fever. She was the one who taught Isabella to ride a bike and clean her scraped knees. Now all of that was threatened. Lucia came out of her thoughts when she felt a small hand touch her arm. "Grandma, are you okay?" Isabella asked, her eyes wide and worried. Lucia forced a smile and caressed her granddaughter's face. "I am, my dear. Just thinking about how everything will turn out." The girl frowned, hesitated for a moment, and then said something that made Lucia's heart clench. "If my parents were here, would they want me to go live with her aunt and uncle?" Lucia blinked, feeling a lump in her throat. "My love, your parents wanted you to be happy, and I know they trusted me to take care of you." Isabella nodded slowly, as if absorbing every word. Then she held her grandmother's hand tightly. "I trust you too, Grandma." Lucia took a deep breath. No matter what happened, she would not let them take her granddaughter. When the doorbell rang, she knew the first step of that fight was about to begin. Lucia walked to the door with her heart racing. When she opened it, she found Marcello, the lawyer and longtime friend, holding his leather briefcase and with a serious expression. He came in, greeted Isabella with a warm smile, and soon sat down at the kitchen table. "Lucia, I did some quick research," he began, taking some papers out of the briefcase. The request from Isabella's aunt and uncle was not made on impulse. They have a very well-structured case. Lucia felt a shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean by that?" Marcello sighed and handed her the papers. "They claim that you are already old and that you do not have enough financial stability to offer Isabella a proper future. They said that she deserves more opportunities, such as elite schools, international travel, and even planning for a future abroad." Lucia pressed her lips together in indignation. They never cared about Isabella before. How can they talk about her future now? Marcello nodded. "I know that, but unfortunately, money and influence count a lot in these cases. They have resources, contacts. If we go to court with just the emotional argument, it will be difficult to win." Lucia felt a lump in her throat. Her trembling fingers held the papers as her mind spun. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. Isabella, who until then had been listening to everything in silence, suddenly spoke up. "But I don't want to go with them." The two adults turned to her. The girl was standing, her fists clenched at her sides, and her eyes shining with determination. "I'm not an object for them to take, just because they want to. I have a life here." Lucia felt her chest tighten with emotion and pride, but Marcello raised his hand, asking for calm. "Isabella, your opinion is very important, but legally, the decision is up to the judge. What we can do is make sure your voice is heard." The girl frowned. "Ow!" Marcello smiled slightly. "Let's work together. You can write a letter explaining why you want to stay with your grandmother. You can talk about your routine, about the things you love here. And in court, if you're called, you need to say what you feel clearly and firmly." Isabella's eyes shone. "I can do that." Lucia took his hand and squeezed it affectionately. "We won't give up, my love." Marcello leaned back in his chair and adjusted his glasses. "Great, but we need more. We'll need the support of teachers, neighbors, anyone who can attest to the fact that you have a healthy and happy environment here." Lucia nodded. "I know some people who can help us." Marcello closed the folder. "Then let's start now. Time is not on our side." Lucia looked at Isabella, who, despite being just a child, seemed ready to face this fight by her side. The battle for custody of her granddaughter had officially begun. The next day, Lucia woke up before sunrise. Her heart was heavy, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. If she wanted to win this battle, she needed to be strong for herself and, most importantly, for Isabella. After breakfast, Marcello called to inform her that Isabella's aunt and uncle wanted to meet before the hearing. At first, Lucia thought about refusing, but she knew she couldn't avoid this confrontation forever. They want to arrange lunch at a restaurant downtown, Marcello explained. Restaurant? Like a casual meeting? Lucia snorted. Do they think they can convince me with an expensive dish and a few rehearsed words? Probably, but it could be a chance for us to better understand their strategy, and for Isabella to see with her own eyes who they really are. Lucia took a deep breath and agreed. Later, at the restaurant, Lucia and Isabella arrived punctually. The place was chic, with impeccably dressed waiters and the smell of sophisticated food in the air. They sat at the reserved table and waited. A few minutes later, Eduardo and Patricia arrived. He, in an impeccable suit, and she, in an elegant dress and sparkling jewelry. The couple approached with rehearsed smiles. Lucia, it's been a while, said Patricia, extending her hand coldly. Lucia shook it out of politeness, but her gaze remained steady. Isabella, my dear, you're so big, said Eduardo, trying to sound affectionate. The girl just nodded, without smiling. She vaguely remembered her uncles, but she had never felt a real connection with them. After a few polite words, Eduardo got straight to the point. Isabella, we know your grandmother took good care of you, but we think it's time to give you a better life. A better life? The girl raised an eyebrow. Yes, dear. Patricia leaned forward, as if she were talking to a small child. Imagine studying at a prestigious private school, learning other languages, traveling the world. You could have all of that. Lucia crossed her arms. Isabella already has a happy life, and the love she receives at home is worth more than any luxury. Eduardo smiled, but it was a condescending smile. Lucia, we know you did your best, but don't you think it's time to think about our future? You don't have the same energy you used to. Isabella put down her cutlery and looked directly at her uncles. You talk as if I were a suitcase that could be carried wherever you want. Silence fell at the table. I don't want to go with you. Patricia laughed nervously. Honey, you don't even know our house. It's decorated especially for you. She has a huge room, a closet full of new clothes. But my grandmother doesn't, Isabella replied. The uncles looked at each other, clearly irritated. Well, dear, Eduardo began to speak, trying to regain control of the conversation. We think you still don't understand what we're offering. But Isabella had already decided. I understand very well, but I know what's most important to me. Lucia felt proud of her granddaughter, but she knew that this war was far from over. Patricia sighed, fixed her hair, and looked at Lucia. Well, see you in court. And with that, the uncles got up and left. Lucia took Isabella's hand and squeezed it. You were amazing, my girl. The girl smiled, but her eyes still held concern. Will they give up, Grandma? Lucia sighed. I don't think so, my love. But no matter what happens, we'll face this together. The battle was just beginning. The days that followed the meeting with her aunt and uncle were tense. Lucia tried to maintain her routine, but the shadow of the hearing was present at every moment. Isabella noticed, but said nothing. She just stayed closer to her grandmother, as if she wanted to make the most of every second by her side. Then, the unexpected came, an invitation to dinner at Eduardo and Patricia's house. Do they want to convince us again? Isabella asked, crossing her arms as she read the message on Lucia's cell phone. It seems so, Lucia replied, rereading the invitation. Do you think we should go? Marcello, the lawyer who had been listening to the conversation, thought for a moment before speaking. It could be a trap to try to influence Isabella, but it could also be an opportunity to see what they're really planning. Lucia sighed and looked at her granddaughter. What do you think, my dear? Isabella hesitated, but then nodded. Let's go. I want to see how far they're going with this story. Underscore. On the night of the dinner, Lucia and Isabella arrived at their aunt and uncle's mansion in an upscale neighborhood of the city. The automatic gate opened, revealing an impeccable garden and a house worthy of a magazine. Impressive, Lucia murmured, feeling Isabella's gaze on her. But it's not a home, the girl said softly. As they entered, they were greeted by Patricia, who smiled in a practiced manner. I'm glad you came. I hope you're hungry. Dinner is wonderful. The dining room was gigantic, with a shiny chandelier and a perfectly set table. Eduardo was already seated, playing with his cell phone. Isabella, dear, how are you feeling? He asked, without taking his eyes off the screen. The girl only responded with a murmur and sat next to her grandmother. Dinner began with superficial conversation, but soon Eduardo got straight to the point. Isabella, we want you to understand that we're doing this for your own good, he said, pouring himself a glass of wine. We don't want to fight with your grandmother. We just want to make sure you have everything you deserve. I already have everything I need, Isabella replied, looking directly at him. Patricia smiled, but her expression showed impatience. My dear, you can have so much more. Imagine studying at an international school, learning languages with native teachers, having access to the best opportunities. You could travel wherever you want. Isabella put down her cutlery and crossed her arms. That's all very nice, but what about my grandmother? Patricia hesitated for a second. You could visit her whenever you want. Visiting her isn't the same thing, Isabella replied. I don't want a life of luxury without my grandmother. Lucia felt a tightness in her chest when she saw her granddaughter's strength. Eduardo sighed and leaned back in his chair. We're trying to be reasonable. You need to understand that the court will consider what's best for you, and they may decide that your grandmother is no longer able to raise you. Lucia felt her blood boil, but before she could answer, Isabella stepped forward. I don't think you understand, the girl said, looking at her uncle seriously. I'm not a prize you can win. Silence filled the table. Lucia finally broke the moment. Eduardo, Patricia, we already know where each of us stands in this story. We'll see you in court. She stood up and took Isabella's hand, walking towards the door without looking back. The battle had not yet been won, but one thing was certain. Isabella would not be easily influenced, and that, in itself, was already a victory. The day after dinner, Lucia sat at the kitchen table with a cup of strong coffee in her hands. The meeting with Isabella's uncles was still going through her mind. They were willing to do anything to take the girl, but she wouldn't let that happen. A little later, Marcelo arrived, carrying his leather briefcase already full of documents and notes. We need a solid strategy, he said, sitting at the table. Lucia nodded. What can we do? Marcelo flipped through a few pages. First, we'll gather witnesses. People who can prove that you provide a stable and loving home for Isabella. Teachers, neighbors, school friends, the more testimonies we have, the better. Can I speak too? Isabella asked, sitting next to her grandmother. Marcelo smiled. Yes, and your testimony may be the strongest of all, but we can't rely on that alone. The court will consider many factors. He then pulled out a paper and handed it to Lucia. Here's a list of what judges usually take into account in these cases. Your bond with Isabella is strong, but they'll look at your age, your financial situation, and the stability of the environment where you live. Lucia read the paper in silence. Her heart sank as she saw the arguments her aunt and uncle could use against her. They'll say I'm too old to take care of her. And we'll prove that's not true, Marcelo assured her. You're healthy, active, you give private lessons, you have an organized routine, all of that counts. Lucia nodded slowly. And what about the financial part? I can't compete with their money. No need. Let's show that money isn't everything. Let's show Isabella's routine, show that she has friends, teachers who support her, a happy and stable life. Isabella smiled and looked at her grandmother. Grandma, can I write a letter to the judge, telling him what my life is like here? Marcello agreed. That could be very powerful. Write it your way, in your own words. Show what really matters to you. Lucia caressed her granddaughter's hand, feeling a surge of pride and emotion. My girl, you have a strong heart. Marcello then turned to Lucia. We also need documents that prove your stability. Paid bills, proof of income, medical reports, anything that helps show that you're able to take care of Isabella. Lucia took a deep breath. I'll take care of everything. Marcello smiled. Great. And there's one more thing. He took an envelope from the folder and placed it on the table. I received this yesterday. Lucia opened the envelope with trembling hands and read it in silence. When she finished, she looked up at Marcello, surprised. This could change everything. Marcello nodded. Exactly. Isabella looked at them both, curious. What is it? Lucia held her granddaughter's hand and smiled. Your parents left you something, and it could be our greatest weapon in court. The battle was far from over, but now Lucia felt she had a real chance of winning. The morning of the hearing arrived faster than Lucia had imagined. The small apartment was busier than ever. Marcello organized the documents. Lucia mentally reviewed everything she needed to remember, and Isabella held an envelope tightly. Ready, my dear? Lucia asked her granddaughter. Isabella looked at her grandmother, her eyes shining with determination. More than ever. A little while later, Marcello's car parked in front of the courthouse. The imposing building made Lucia feel small, but she took a deep breath and squeezed Isabella's hand, who smiled at her as if to say, We're in this together. Inside the courtroom, Eduardo and Patricia were already sitting next to their lawyer, impeccably dressed. The uncles exchanged glances with Isabella, but the girl quickly looked away. The judge entered the room, and the hearing began. We are here today to determine the custody of the minor Isabella Martins, the judge announced. The request was made by the maternal uncles, Eduardo and Patricia Martins, who claimed better conditions to provide for the child's well-being. The uncle's lawyer was the first to speak. He gave an impeccable speech, highlighting Lucia's age, her modest retirement, and the lack of opportunities that Isabella would have by her side. He spoke about elite private schools, international travel, financial stability, and all the advantages that the uncles could offer. This child deserves the best, concluded the lawyer. And we know that, despite the good the grandmother's intentions, she cannot provide the same opportunities. Lucia felt her chest tighten. It was not the first time they had heard this, but now, said in that way, it seemed so cruel. When it was Marcello's turn to speak, he stood up calmly. Your Honor, it is true that Isabella's uncles have money and influence. But what we are discussing here is not a prize, but a girl's life. He presented documents that proved Lucia's stability, proof of income, medical reports that showed her good health, and testimonies from teachers and neighbors who said how happy Isabella was there. Money can offer comfort, but does not build bonds. What matters is where this child feels loved and safe. The judge listened attentively and, after a few minutes of silence, turned to Isabella. I would like to hear the minor's opinion. Isabella, do you want to tell us what you feel? The girl swallowed hard, but stood up firmly. She looked at her grandmother and then at the judge. Your Honor, I know my aunt and uncle are rich. I know their house is big, and I could have a huge room and expensive clothes. But none of that matters if I don't feel loved. She took a deep breath before continuing. My grandmother has been with me since I was a baby. She taught me how to ride a bike, helped me with my schoolwork, took care of me when I was sick. She taught me what family means. Isabella's voice began to crack, but she stood her ground. I am not an object that can be moved from one place to another. I am a person, and I choose to stay with my grandmother. The room fell silent. Even her aunt and uncle seemed surprised by the girl's conviction. Then Isabella took out the envelope she was holding and handed it to the judge. My parents left this for me. The judge opened the envelope and began to read. It was a letter written by Clara and Miguel, Isabella's parents, shortly before they died. In it, they said that if anything happened to them, they trusted Lucia to raise their daughter with love and dedication. When he finished reading, the judge sighed and adjusted his glasses. I will make my decision based on everything that has been presented here. Lucia held Isabella's hand and closed her eyes. The verdict was about to be given. The silence inside the courtroom was absolute. Everyone awaited the judge's decision. Lucia felt her heart racing and squeezed Isabella's hand tightly. The judge cleared his throat and began to speak, his deep voice echoing throughout the room. After carefully considering all the evidence presented, he paused briefly, looking at each of the parties, including the documents, testimonies, and, above all, the wishes expressed by the minor. I have reached a conclusion. Lucia held her breath. It is clear that Isabella has a stable, happy, and healthy life under the care of her grandmother, Dona Lucia Martins. Although Mr. Eduardo and Mrs. Patricia Martins may offer financial advantages, there is no evidence that the minor is in a situation of risk or neglect with her current guardian. Isabella looked at her grandmother, holding back tears. In view of this, and respecting the minor's wishes, I grant permanent custody of Isabella Martins to her grandmother, Mrs. Lucia. Time seemed to stop for a moment. Lucia felt a wave of relief so strong that tears streamed down her face. She hugged Isabella tightly, feeling her heart light for the first time in weeks. But before they could leave, Eduardo and Patricia stood up quickly. "Your Honor, this is a mistake," Eduardo protested. "We have resources. We can guarantee a better future for her." The judge looked at them seriously. "Money does not define a home, Mr. Martins. The emotional well-being and happiness of the child are what matter most here. The case is closed." The uncle stood still, not knowing what to say. Patricia looked at Isabella, who was hugging her grandmother, and sighed heavily. "Let's go, Eduardo." Without further arguments, they left the room. Marcelo smiled at Lucia and Isabella. "We did it." Isabella sniffed and looked at the lawyer. "It wasn't just you, doctor. I did my part too." Everyone laughed. As they left the courtroom, Lucia felt the wind blow on her face and took a deep breath, as if she were freeing herself from a great weight. "Let's go home, my dear." Isabella smiled. Home, sweet home. And, hand in hand, grandmother and granddaughter headed to the place where they had always belonged. The ride home was silent, but filled with emotion. Lucia still felt her heart racing, but this time it was with relief. Finally, after so much fear and uncertainty, she knew that her granddaughter was safe. Isabella, sitting in the passenger seat, looked outside, observing the streets she loved so much. The simple neighborhood, the little square where she learned to ride a bike, the school where she made her first friends. None of that could be replaced by a luxurious house and expensive trips. "Grandma, we did it," she said softly with a shy smile. Lucia laughed through her tears and held her granddaughter's hand. "We did it, my dear." When they arrived home, they were greeted with applause. Neighbors and friends were gathered at the door of the small building, holding improvised signs and bringing cakes and sweets to celebrate. "We knew you would win," exclaimed Donut Sida, the neighbor from the floor below, hugging Lucia tightly. Marcello, the lawyer, was also there, smiling with satisfaction. "I never doubted you," he said, winking at Isabella. The girl laughed, but soon her gaze was caught by something unexpected. In the middle of the small crowd, Patricia and Eduardo were there, silent. They didn't have the arrogant expression they had before. On the contrary, they seemed regretful. Patricia was the first to step forward. "Lucia, can I talk to you?" The celebratory atmosphere became tense. Everyone expected the worst, but Lucia, with her years of wisdom, just nodded. Patricia took a deep breath. We made a mistake." Eduardo looked at Isabella and then at his mother-in-law. "We thought we were doing the right thing. But in the end, we realized that we never stopped to listen to what Isabella really wanted." The girl exchanged a quick glance with her grandmother, as if trying to understand if that was real. "So you gave up?" Isabella asked, still suspicious. "We didn't just give up," Eduardo answered. "We came to apologize." Lucia felt a lump in her throat. She never imagined that day would come. Patricia smiled, a real smile this time. "You won, Lucia. But more than that, you taught us a lesson." Silence hung for a moment, until Isabella, with all the maturity she had shown until then, took a step forward. "I still don't trust you completely, but I think we can start from scratch." And at that moment, something unexpected happened. A hug. Patricia, Eduardo, Isabella, and Lucia stood there, still, trying to rebuild something that never really existed. The custody battle was over, but a new journey was about to begin. In the days following the hearing, Lucia and Isabella's lives returned to their normal rhythm, but with a different lightness. For the first time in months, they could sleep peacefully without the fear of being separated. Mornings were the same again. The smell of coffee filling the apartment, the sound of Isabella's piano keys echoing through the house, and laughter during breakfast. It was a simple routine, but full of meaning. But something had changed. After the apology on the day of the celebration, Eduardo and Patricia began to try to get closer to Isabella. At first, the girl avoided them, but Lucia, with her infinite patience, encouraged her to give it a chance. "My dear, forgiving doesn't mean forgetting what happened, but rather allowing something new to begin." And, over time, Isabella began to allow small interactions. First, there were quick phone calls, then casual meetings at Lucia's house, and eventually even visits to her aunt and uncle's mansion, always certain that her true home was next to her grandmother. But the biggest change happened when Isabella walked into the kitchen one morning, holding a notebook in her hands. "Grandma, I have an idea." Lucia looked at her granddaughter affectionately. "What's wrong, my dear?" The girl opened the notebook, revealing pages full of notes. "I want to write a book about everything we've been through. I want to tell our story." Lucia smiled, feeling her chest swell with pride. "A book? Yes," Isabella said excitedly. "I want other children who are going through this to know that they are not alone. I want them to understand that family is not about money, but about love." Lucia blinked back tears and caressed her granddaughter's face. "You've always been so special, my girl." The months passed, and with Marcello's help, Isabella managed to turn her idea into reality. Her little book was first published at school, then at other institutions, until it caught the attention of a publisher. And a year later, Isabella stood before an audience, holding her first book in her hands. "My story is not just about a custody battle," she said, looking at the people in the audience. "It's about love, about struggle, about never giving up on those who really matter." In the front row, Lucia held the hands of Eduardo and Patricia, who were now present not as enemies, but as family. She knew her mission was accomplished, because, in the end, love always wins.